Hey everyone, welcome back to another quiet night of mildly tragic history. So, get cozy, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself a cup of something warm and forgettable, because tonight we're sinking into the strange, uncomfortable world of royal women who were too precious, too sacred, or too inbred to even touch. These were the daughters and wives locked behind silk curtains and golden cages, the ones treated as living relics, or, let's be honest, as extremely expensive breeding experiments. You'll see how dynasties obsessed with bloodlines ended up creating women so pure they couldn't even walk without supervision, or so divine no one was allowed to breathe near them. And sometimes, both. Let's drift back first to the glittering, claustrophobic courts of early modern Europe, where the phrase born royal often meant born lonely, sickly, and weirdly famous for your jawline. Isabella of Spain, the unapproachable heiress, will start in Spain. Because Spain in the 15th century was basically the family tree of Europe's future problems. Isabella of Spain. Yes, that Isabella, the one who married Ferdinand and financed Christopher Columbus's questionable little sea trip, was obsessed with control and purity, especially when it came to her daughters. One of them, Catherine of Aragon, would eventually marry Henry VIII and become England's tragic imported queen. But before all that Tudor mess, Catherine grew up in a world where her mother inspected her letters, meals, and yes, sometimes even her body weight, because royal daughters were literal currency. Imagine your value being measured in how untouched you appeared. Not educated, not charming, just untouched. That's basically how Catherine's early life went. No boyfriends, no casual handshakes, no oops, I brushed sleeves with the stable boy. Royal virtue was like a brand name. Lose it, and the whole family's market value plummets. So by the time she finally met Henry VIII, she was the human equivalent of a porcelain teacup no one dared to use. And of course, Henry being Henry immediately treated her like something to break. But Catherine's upbringing wasn't unique. Isabella's daughters were raised as symbols, visible proof that Spain's royal blood was untainted. This purity culture wasn't moral, it was political. If your daughter was still unsullied by the time the marriage contract was sealed, your alliance was worth more gold. And if she wasn't, well, convents existed for a reason, so yeah, royal chastity, not so much a virtue as a business strategy. Let's float over to Austria, the Habsburgs and their walking family tree, all right. Float with me over the Alps. We're heading to the land of decorative inbreeding, Austria. The Habsburgs, bless them, were Europe's most enthusiastic collectors of their own genes. If you've ever seen a family portrait where everyone looks like they're slowly melting, that's the Habsburgs. And in this dynasty, royal women weren't just untouchable, they were literally too genetically delicate to risk much handling. Take poor Margaret Teresa of Spain, the little girl from the famous Velázquez painting Las Meninas. Big dress, tiny face, surrounded by servants all staring at her like she's the world's most expensive doll. She was the niece and the cousin of her future husband. Because of course she was. And that wasn't even considered strange. Margaret was pampered to the point of absurdity. She had attendants whose entire job was to carry her dress. Others brushed her hair. Some just stood there to hand her gloves. But she was never allowed to be alone. Not for a second. Because the royal womb had to be guarded like the crown jewels. When she was finally old enough, which, in Habsburg math, meant around 15, she was shipped off to Vienna to marry Emperor Leopold I, her uncle-cousin something hybrid. Their union was celebrated as the ultimate family reunion/DNA recycling program. She died at 21, after giving birth multiple times in a body that probably needed a break after the second cousin-level pregnancy. Her husband mourned her, of course, then remarried another niece. Because when your family motto is basically, keep it in the bloodline, you don't learn lessons. Maria Anna of Spain, the princess who couldn't touch the ground. While we're here, let's meet Margaret's aunt, Maria Anna of Spain, another Habsburg, and one of the most untouchable women of her era, literally. At the Spanish court, royal daughters weren't supposed to touch anything unroyal. Maria Anna was carried everywhere on the shoulders of servants, so her feet wouldn't make contact with the floor, because apparently, marble wasn't royal enough for her soles. Her dresses were so wide they needed their own postal code, and her meals were pre-tasted by courtiers terrified of being accused of poisoning someone who'd never even held her own spoon. When she eventually became Holy Roman Empress, yes, by marrying another close relative. She was already half broken by years of ceremonial isolation. By all accounts, she was kind, devout, and extremely confused about normal human interaction. Even her letters read like she's trying to sound casual but doesn't know how to people. She once thanked her brother for sending her a parrot to talk to during Mass, which is either endearing or deeply sad, possibly both. Now, let's glide to France, where untouchable meant divine. Meanwhile, in France, the idea of being untouchable wasn't about genetics. It was about holiness. The French monarchy had a literal theology built around the idea that the king's touch could heal diseases. The royal touch. So, naturally, the queen's touch had to be equally sacred, or at least unavailable. Many queens were treated like living relics, to be admired but not approached. One of the most tragic was Marie Therese of Spain, who married Louis XIV, the Sun King. She came from, you guessed it, the Habsburg stockpile, and her entire life at Versailles was one long lesson in invisibility. Her husband built the most glamorous palace in Europe, and then more or less ignored her inside it. Marie Therese was small, shy, and unremarkable in conversation, which, at the French court, was basically a death sentence. While Louis XIV flaunted mistresses like trophies, his queen was expected to smile gently and remain saintly. She had her own apartments, but was rarely seen outside of religious ceremonies. Her main job was producing heirs, which she did, briefly. Most of her children died young, and she spent the rest of her life drifting between chapel and nursery, increasingly isolated. When she died at 44, one courtier wrote that the court hardly noticed, which, in Versailles terms, might be the cruelest epitaph imaginable. Meanwhile, in Russia, the Tsarevnas nobody saw right. Let's drift northeast, to a palace that made Versailles look like a lively picnic, the Kremlin. In 17th century Russia, before Peter the Great decided to westernize everything, royal women lived in a system called the terem, basically, noble lockdown. The terem was a secluded set of chambers where royal daughters and sisters were kept out of sight from men. They could see the world only through latticed windows. They communicated with outsiders through servants. And if they were ever spotted by a man who wasn't family, the solution wasn't forgiveness. It was permanent relocation to a convent. One of the most famous of these secluded women was Sophia Alexeyevna, Peter the Great's half-sister. She was intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely fed up with being treated like an ornamental ghost. Eventually, she led a short-lived coup and ruled as regent, until Peter locked her in a convent anyway. At least she got to see sunlight again, though it came through iron bars. But most Russian princesses never got that far. They embroidered. They prayed. They existed like museum exhibits of virtue, dusted occasionally by attendants who probably envied their beds. Being untouchable wasn't glamorous. It was a life sentence of stillness. The illness of being pure. Let's pause here and notice a pattern. When you treat women like sacred relics, they tend to fall apart, physically and mentally. Generations of dynastic isolation meant most of these royal women were sickly from birth. Low fertility, weak immune systems, and the infamous Habsburg jaw were the side effects of purity by design. By the late 1600s, entire royal families were built on cousin marriages, so dense they might as well have been loops in a family spreadsheet. Take Charles II of Spain, Margaret Teresa's son. He's not technically in our women category, but he's what happens when you keep breeding untouchables. Charles was so inbred he couldn't chew properly, talk clearly, or produce children. He was the physical end of a genetic echo chamber. And the women around him, his mother, his wives, were treated as both caretakers and potential miracle workers, expected to restore the dynasty through sheer womb power. Spoiler, it didn't work. Let's float back west, the English Virgin Queen. Now a slightly different flavor of untouchable. Elizabeth Warren of England. She wasn't untouchable because of blood purity, but because of her own branding. Elizabeth figured out early that being a married queen meant being controlled by a man. So she made herself the myth, the Virgin Queen, God's bride, England's eternal single lady. It was brilliant marketing. It made her politically powerful, culturally iconic, and, by all accounts, profoundly lonely. Elizabeth flirted constantly because it kept courtiers guessing. But she never let anyone actually get close. Her court became a theater of restraint. She was the center of attention, but untouchable by design. One ambassador described her as a woman who fears to be handled even by praise. That about sums it up. By the end of her life, Elizabeth's image was more symbol than person. White makeup, stiff collar, a literal halo of pearls. Untouchable, immortal, and exhausted. The price of sacred skin. Across centuries, the pattern holds. Royal women were elevated, protected, and isolated, until they became almost abstract. Whether it was purity, divinity, or dynasty, the idea of being too important to touch always ended the same way. in loneliness. The irony is that the higher they were placed, the less they lived. They didn't eat without permission. They didn't walk alone. They were surrounded by silk and gold, yet never felt human warmth outside ceremonial duty. So when you see those portraits, the serene queens, the veiled princesses, the women standing perfectly still in a storm of lace, remember that those poses weren't just artistic choices. They were real, lived conditions. They were frozen because that's how they existed. Let's pause here. Take a breath. Hey again, if you're still awake or barely awake, welcome back. Let's keep floating down the soft, gold-threaded corridors of royal loneliness. In this next stretch of time, something interesting starts to happen. The world's changing. Empires are growing, revolutions are brewing, wigs are getting taller. And while kings are busy bankrupting nations for fancy wars and imported sugar, royal women are quietly inventing new ways to be untouchable. Not because they wanted to, but because it was the only way to survive in a system built to own them. So tonight, we'll meet the queens who hid behind gloves, the empress who turned isolation into an art form, and a few lonely hearts who found love through scandal, or occasionally through extremely elaborate letters. Marie Antoinette, the porcelain prisoner. Let's begin with the world's favorite misunderstood queen, Marie Antoinette. Now, Marie gets a lot of bad press. Let them eat cake, diamond scandals, all that stuff. But before she became a symbol of decadence, she was basically a lonely teenager imported from Austria into a gilded fishbowl. She was 14. Her new husband, the future Louis XVI, was 15. Neither of them had any idea what they were doing. And yet, every morning, dozens of courtiers watched her wake up, change clothes, and even use her toiletries. Literally. There was an official ceremony for brushing her hair, because apparently nothing says royalty like 20 people standing around while you pick out a dress. Marie's untouchability came not from divine purity, but from the endless ritual of French court life. Every movement was witnessed. Every emotion was translated into politics. She was expected to be charming, serene, and above all, touchless. Even affection had to be performed from a distance. Her husband was shy, possibly anxious, possibly disinterested. So, the young queen, lonely, bored, and constantly criticized, retreated into what she could control: fashion, gardens, and the illusion of freedom. At her private estate, the Petit Trianon, she created a fantasy village where she could dress as a shepherdess and pretend to be normal. It was adorable, and also politically suicidal, because while she played at simplicity, France was starving. By the time she finally reached her 30s, her untouchable status had turned against her. The people who once adored her image now hated it. She became the ultimate symbol of royal detachment. A woman so far removed from reality, she might as well have been made of porcelain, which honestly is what she'd been from the start. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, the woman who hated being seen. Let's drift back to Austria, because the Habsburgs just keep giving. This time, we meet Empress Elisabeth, better known as Sisi. She's the 19th century version of a royal influencer. Stunning, mysterious, permanently miserable. Sisi was born a Bavarian duchess, married Emperor Franz Joseph at 16, and instantly regretted it. She hated court life, hated rules, and especially hated being looked at. But she couldn't avoid it. She was the empire's beauty queen. Her long hair was famous. Her waist was legendary. Her anxiety was very real. She developed strict daily routines that bordered on obsession. Hours of exercise, restrictive diets, endless hair rituals. And gloves, always gloves. Sisi wore gloves constantly in public, even indoors, partly as a fashion statement, partly as armor. They separated her skin from the world. She also avoided being touched emotionally. Her marriage was cold, her mother-in-law controlling, her children taken away for proper upbringing. So Sisi did what many untouchable women did. She traveled, constantly. She became a wandering empress, riding horses, writing poetry, visiting spas, pretending freedom was just another train ticket away. But the irony? The more she tried to disappear, the more people idolized her. By the time she was assassinated at 60, stabbed by a random anarchist while walking by Lake Geneva, the public called her a tragic angel, an untouchable beauty to the end. And she'd probably hate that. Queen Victoria, the widow who wrapped the world in mourning from Vienna. Let's float to London. It's foggy, it's polite, it's emotionally repressed. Perfect setting for Queen Victoria. Now, Victoria didn't start as untouchable. In fact, she was known for being rather touchy. When she married Prince Albert, the two were famously affectionate. For a royal couple, almost scandalously so. They wrote endless letters full of romantic cliches. They actually liked each other. And then Albert died. He was 42. She was 41. And she never recovered. For the next 40 years, 40, Victoria turned her grief into a national costume. She wore black every day. She rarely appeared in public. She refused to let anyone else occupy the emotional space he'd left behind. Her staff learned to avoid eye contact. Her children described her presence as heavy silence. The Queen became an institution of mourning, a walking monument to emotional distance. And through it all, she became more powerful than ever. The less she appeared, the more sacred she seemed. She turned her pain into myth, the Virgin Queen 2.0, now with added widow energy. Charlotte of Belgium, the queen who lost her mind in Mexico. Okay, let's take a detour to one of history's most tragic royal misplacements. Empress Charlotte of Mexico. She started out as a Belgian princess. Smart, ambitious, a little too serious for her age. Then she married Archduke Maximilian of Austria, younger brother to Emperor Franz Joseph. The same family Sisi married into. So naturally, things went downhill immediately. When France decided to install Maximilian as Emperor of Mexico in the 1860s, because colonialism just couldn't resist meddling, Charlotte followed him. She imagined herself a benevolent ruler bringing enlightenment to a distant land. Instead, she found rebellion, disease, and a husband who spent more time staring at exotic birds than governing. As their empire crumbled, Charlotte's mental health did too. She became paranoid, sleepless, and convinced that people were poisoning her. When she returned to Europe to beg Napoleon III for help, she had a breakdown, screaming in the middle of the palace, refusing food, hiding behind curtains. She spent the next 60 years locked away in a castle near Brussels, speaking to imaginary courtiers, writing letters to a husband who'd been executed decades earlier. Her attendants said she refused to be touched. Even doctors weren't allowed near her. She would only speak through closed doors. Charlotte became untouchable not by choice, but by the slow unraveling of a mind built for duty, not reality. It's hard to think of a sadder symbol of royal isolation. Let's float north. The gloved Queen of Denmark in Denmark. A lesser-known but quietly fascinating figure was Queen Caroline Matilda. Born in England, married off to the mentally unstable King Christian VII of Denmark at 15. He was erratic, emotionally distant, and sometimes forgot he was married. Caroline Matilde, like many lonely queens, eventually found comfort elsewhere. Specifically, in the royal physician, Johann Struensee. Their affair was scandalous, yes, but also strangely human. For a while, the two actually reformed the Danish government. Abolished torture, improved education, modernized laws. Basically, they made Denmark slightly less medieval. Then, of course, everyone panicked. Struensee was executed. Caroline Matilde was exiled. And for the rest of her brief life, she lived in quiet isolation, guarded, monitored, surrounded by servants who weren't allowed to touch her. She died of scarlet fever at 23, and Denmark pretended it never happened. She'd worn gloves through much of her exile, partly to stay queenly, partly to keep people away. It's hard to say which reason mattered more, the paradox of royal purity. So, what's the pattern here? From Marie Antoinette to Sisi, from Victoria to Charlotte. Every untouchable woman lived under the illusion that purity meant safety. In reality, it meant the opposite. They were the most visible people in the world, and yet invisible as human beings. Every portrait was an act of erasure. Every title, a wall. The gloved hands, the painted smiles, the whispered reputations. They were all just survival mechanisms. If you couldn't control your life, at least you could control your image. An image was everything. In the 18th and 19th centuries, royal women weren't measured by power, but by perfection. They had to look flawless, behave flawlessly, and feel nothing that couldn't be embroidered into lace. So they turned themselves into myths. Fragile, elegant, tragically perfect myths. The world loved them for it, and then quietly destroyed them for it too. Untouchable. Even in memory it's strange, isn't it? Centuries later, we still picture these women as delicate icons. Marie Antoinette with her powdered hair, Sisi with her waist-length curls, Victoria with her veil, Charlotte with her haunted stare. We see the surface and call it beauty. But beauty, in their world, was just another kind of armor. Maybe that's why their stories still linger. They remind us that power can look like luxury, but feel like a cage. That being adored isn't the same as being known. And that sometimes, the most untouchable people in history were the ones who just needed someone to hold their hand. Take a breath. Let the century fade behind you. The rustle of skirts, the clink of jewels, the soft echo of silence around a queen who couldn't be touched. In part 3, we'll drift into the modern era where the old rules start to crack. where cameras replace courtiers, and untouchable royal women are suddenly forced to live under a different kind of spotlight. We'll talk about the invention of royal celebrity, and what happens when isolation goes public. So, close your eyes. We'll pick up the story soon, in the age of flashbulbs, scandals, and queens who smiled for the camera, but never quite escaped the glass walls. Hey again, if you're still here, congratulations. You've now outlasted most royal marriages. We're leaving behind the age of candlelit ballrooms and entering the world of flash photography. It's the 1900s now, the century of progress, modernity, and a brand new invention that ruins every royal secret. The camera. For the first time in history, royal women weren't just untouchable, they were everywhere. On postcards, newspapers, early films, and the public wanted more, always more. But of course, the rules hadn't changed. They were still supposed to be perfect, pure, and slightly tragic. Just now, in sharper focus. Let's meet the women who had to learn how to stay untouchable in a world that suddenly wanted to touch everything. Tsarina Alexandra, the saint who broke apart. Let's start in Russia again, because no one does doomed royalty quite like the Romanovs. Alexandra Feodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II, was born a German princess. She was shy, devout, and painfully earnest. Basically the worst combination for surviving Russian court politics. From the moment she arrived, she was treated with suspicion. Too quiet, too foreign, too spiritual. She had a nervous sensitivity that made her seem cold, though really, she was just anxious. Even her handwriting looks tense. And then, of course, came her children. 4 daughters, beautiful, healthy, and entirely the wrong gender for an empire obsessed with male heirs. When her long-awaited son Alexei was finally born, he had hemophilia. A hereditary curse from Queen Victoria's line. That's when the walls closed in. Alexandra became obsessed with protecting him. His slightest bruise could kill him. So she built her life around secrecy, whispers, and religious rituals. Enter Rasputin, the peasant mystic with suspicious healing skills and an even more suspicious beard. He convinced Alexandra that he could save Alexei through prayer. And she believed him. Because she was desperate. Soon Rasputin had more access to the royal family than half the nobility. He touched what no one else could, both literally and symbolically. And in the end, it destroyed her reputation. The public saw her as a mad, possessed woman, a puppet of some unwashed monk. Her untouchable holiness turned into public disgust. And when the revolution came, it didn't matter how sacred her isolation had been. The myth couldn't save her. The Romanovs were executed in 1918. The last royal family to learn that divinity offers no bulletproofing. Queen Mary of Teck, the reluctant ice sculpture. Let's cross over to Britain now, where restraint wasn't just a virtue, it was a full-time profession. Queen Mary, wife of King George V, grandmother to Queen Elizabeth II, was perhaps the most perfectly untouchable woman in the modern age. People described her as dignified to the point of terror. Children froze in her presence. Even her dogs probably sat straighter when she entered the room. But Mary wasn't cold by nature. She was just shaped by a world that demanded perfection. Her early life was modest by royal standards. She didn't have much money, though she had plenty of titles. When she married George, she was determined to embody royal duty so flawlessly that no one could question her place. She succeeded. Too well. Mary developed an expressionless poise that became her brand. She stood like a statue at ceremonies. She rarely displayed affection in public. And she collected jewels the way some people collect anxieties. To her children, she was distant, but dependable. To the public, she was marble come to life, elegant, impeccable, untouchable, and that's exactly how she liked it. When asked once if she ever laughed, she reportedly replied, "Of course I laugh, but only when it's appropriate," which, if you think about it, probably wasn't often. Princess Diana, the untouchable who reached out. Now we drift closer to our own time. To the woman who shattered the myth from the inside out. Diana, Princess of Wales. By the 1980s, royalty had become global celebrity. The cameras never slept, and neither did the gossip. So when Diana married Prince Charles in that enormous dress, 25 feet of silk, 70 pounds of expectation, she wasn't marrying a man so much as a machine. At first, she seemed like a modern fairy tale. The shy kindergarten teacher turned princess. Everyone loved her. The press adored her, and the palace panicked. Because Diana did something no untouchable royal woman was supposed to do. She touched people. Literally. She hugged children with AIDS. She held the hands of lepers. She comforted the grieving and the sick without gloves or protocol. It was revolutionary and deeply threatening. The monarchy had built its power on distance, that serene, unreachable image. But Diana made empathy fashionable, and for that, she was adored by millions and quietly despised by the institution that couldn't control her. Her personal life, as we know, unraveled under the same spotlight that made her famous. She was too real, too emotional, too visible. The public watched her smile, cry, break, in real time. When she died in 1997, the global reaction wasn't just grief. It was shock at how much she'd changed the narrative. For the first time, the world mourned a royal not for her purity or her poise, but for her humanity. And yet, in death, she became what she'd resisted all her life. Untouchable again. A saint in designer shoes, immortal, frozen, perfect. Grace Kelly, the movie star who became a monument before Diana. There was Grace Kelly, the American actress who married Prince Rainier of Monaco in 1956 and became Princess Grace. It was the ultimate fantasy. Hollywood meets monarchy. Cinderella, with better lighting. Grace had it all. Beauty, fame, an Oscar. A fairy tale wedding that looked like it was sponsored by angels. But behind the lace and champagne, it was another story. Monaco was tiny, conservative, and suffocating. Grace had to give up acting, the one thing that made her Grace Kelly. She was expected to transform overnight into a perfect royal consort. No scandals, no improvisation, no emotion that couldn't be printed on a postage stamp. She played the role so well that the world forgot it was a role. In public, she was serene. In private, restless. Friends said she missed acting so much she'd sometimes rehearse lines from old scripts just to feel alive again. Her car crash in 1982 sealed her myth forever. Beautiful, tragic, frozen in time at 52. Like Diana, she became an image of impossible grace. And like all untouchable women before her, she disappeared into her own perfection. The last generation of porcelain princesses, by the late 20th century. Royal women had two choices, be flawless or be eaten alive, and most tried to do both. Queen Elizabeth II perfected the art of invisibility. She said little, showed less, and survived longer than anyone else in the business. Her emotional restraint became her superpower. Meanwhile, the younger royals, Margaret, Anne, Diana, Fergie, each rebelled in their own ways, testing the limits of what a woman in pearls could get away with. Every gesture was analyzed, every rumor magnified, and the public, as always, was insatiable. Even in the 21st century, the pattern lingers. Royal women are still defined by what they don't do. Don't speak too much. Don't show too much. Don't touch too much. Smile, wave, repeat. The tools changed. Instagram instead of oil paint, paparazzi instead of court painters. But the rules stayed the same. The performance of distance. The art of untouchability. A line that never broke. If you trace the lineage, from Catherine of Aragon to Marie Antoinette, from Sisi to Diana, you see a pattern of porcelain continuity. Different crowns, same glass walls. Their isolation shifted form, but never disappeared. Where once it was religion, now it's media. Where once it was etiquette, now it's public opinion. And every century finds new ways to trap women inside admiration. The modern princess smiles through scrutiny. The medieval one prayed through it. Both perform grace under watchful eyes. Both live in service to an image that isn't quite theirs. Untouchable. Still. So maybe the story doesn't end. Maybe untouchable isn't a curse from the past. It's just been rebranded. In the old portraits, they stand with stiff spines and folded hands. Today, they walk red carpets and pose for official photos. Different poses, same message. You may look. You may admire. But don't get too close. There's something quietly haunting about that. Because after 600 years, it means we've learned to keep watching. And they've learned to keep performing. Royal women remain both the subject and the story. The gaze never goes away. It just gets higher resolution. So, as we fade out tonight, maybe think about how strange it is. That every age builds its own kind of palace, and every palace has invisible walls. Some are made of etiquette, some of silk, some of screens. But for the women born inside, it always feels the same. Everyone wants to see you. No one wants to know you, so rest now. Let the portraits fade to black. The queens, the empresses, the princesses. They're still standing, frozen in time, waiting for someone brave enough to touch the myth. And maybe that's the softest kind of rebellion they ever had. Being remembered at all. Hey again. If you're still awake, well done. You've now officially outlasted 3 marriages, 4 revolutions, and at least 1 Tudor execution. But let's move gently into the 21st century. The air is thinner here. The crown's lighter, or at least more photogenic. And yet, somehow, the women wearing them are still playing the same ancient game. Be perfect, but also relatable. Be mysterious, but also approachable. Basically, be a saint who smiles naturally on live TV easy, right? Kate Middleton, the calm in the storm. Let's start with Catherine, Princess of Wales, formerly Kate Middleton. She's the perfect modern continuation of the untouchable royal tradition, but with better lighting and public relations training. Kate's story begins like a modern fairy tale. A middle-class girl meets a prince at university. They fall in love. They break up briefly because he's not ready. And then they marry in an event so lavish that people took days off work just to watch it on television. From day one, Kate was trained to embody serenity, poise, control. The kind of calm that doesn't just look natural, it looks genetically engineered. No tears, no temper, no slip-ups. She doesn't give interviews. She doesn't reveal emotion. Even her laugh feels focus group approved, and that's the point. Kate is the royal family's counterspell. The antidote to every scandal before her. She's the anti-Diana, the anti-Fergie, the anti-anyone who made the monarchy look human. When tabloids attack her, she doesn't respond. When rumors swirl, she smiles. When people critique her silence, she stays silent louder. It's performance art, really. In a world addicted to oversharing, she wins by undersharing. The ultimate modern untouchable, and it works. Her image is immaculate. She photographs like a watercolor painting of composure. She's turned invisibility into elegance. Exactly what Queen Mary of Tech would have done if Queen Mary had access to hair gloss and Instagram filters. But, and there's always a but, the price is the same it's always been. Privacy traded for reverence. Authenticity replaced by ideal. The crown still requires silence. Only the stage has changed. Meghan Markle, the woman who touched the myth now. Let's talk about the one who did touch it, and paid for it. Meghan Markle. An American actress, biracial, outspoken, feminist, divorced. Basically, a checklist of everything the British tabloids can't handle before breakfast. When Meghan joined the royal family, she was seen as a breath of fresh air. Modern, confident, photogenic. But it didn't take long before that same freshness was framed as threat. The palace wanted grace and distance. The press wanted chaos and headlines. And Meghan, being human, responded. She spoke about feeling isolated, ignored, unsupported. And in doing so, she broke the code. Royal women don't talk about pain. They perform through it. They cry in private, then smile in public. Meghan flipped that script on live television. She became the first royal woman in centuries to say the quiet part out loud. I wasn't okay. It was honest, vulnerable, and it made people furious, because the modern audience, for all its progress, still prefers its princesses silent and photogenic. Untouchable but not unreachable. Relatable but not too real. When Meghan and Harry stepped back from royal duties, it wasn't rebellion so much as self-preservation. They chose autonomy over image, freedom over fairy tale. But of course, that made her even more fascinating. Because in the royal world, leaving the palace doesn't make you disappear. It just makes you mythic. Another chapter in the long story of women who got too close to the truth. The irony of modern royalty. Here's the strange thing about being a royal woman today. You can have millions of followers, global recognition, and a literal PR team, and still be trapped in the same gilded cage that Catherine of Aragon sat in 500 years ago. The difference is, the bars are digital now. Tweets instead of edicts, cameras instead of courtiers. A new kind of surveillance. Relentless, instant, and hungry. And the public's relationship with royal women hasn't evolved as much as we like to think. We still watch. We still judge. We still demand beauty, composure, mystery, and emotional endurance, all at once. It's the oldest performance art in Europe. Live-streamed. The crown's eternal script if we lined them all up. From Isabella of Castile to Meghan Markle. You'd see the same choreography. Hands folded. Eyes cast down. The perfect smile. Each a study in how to exist publicly while feeling privately trapped. For centuries, royal women were told their virtue was their power. Now it's their brand. Different word, same meaning. They still can't be angry. They still can't be messy. They still can't be ordinary. And every attempt to be human, to laugh too loud, to speak too honestly, becomes headline material. Breaking protocol. Defying tradition. As if tradition were a fragile glass vase, and every royal woman's job is to not drop it. Untouchable by design. The irony, of course, is that untouchable has always been a survival mechanism. It's not arrogance, it's armor. When Catherine of Aragon refused to yield, she was protecting her dignity. When Marie Antoinette built her private fantasy world, she was escaping cruelty. When Alexandra turned to Rasputin, she was shielding her dying son. When Diana hugged patience, she was reaching for purpose in a gilded vacuum. And when Kate and Meghan navigate the same stage today, one with silence, one with speech, they're both doing the same thing, trying to stay human in a machine that doesn't reward humanity. The untouchable myth isn't about purity. It's about endurance, the audience's role. And then, there's us, the spectators. We've traded the court gossip of Versailles for online discourse, but the energy's the same. We say we want authenticity, but the second it appears, we dissect it. We scroll, we judge, we move on. Royal women aren't untouchable because they want to be. They're untouchable because we keep touching their stories until there's nothing left of them. The gaze that once belonged to portrait painters now belongs to us. Our collective curiosity keeps the myth alive. The endless loop of fascination and fatigue. It's strangely comforting. In a way, in the consistency of human nosiness, the quiet legacy. So, what does it all mean? This long history of unreachable queens and porcelain princesses. Maybe that power always demands a little distance. Maybe that beauty, when institutionalized, becomes a kind of prison. Or maybe it's just human nature, to build pedestals, and then complain that the people on them look lonely. Every few decades, someone new tries to break the pattern. A queen, a princess, a duchess. And every time, the story ends the same way. They're remembered not for their laughter, but for their silence. But in that silence, there's survival. A stillness that stretches across time, from Tudor tapestries to glossy tabloids. A strange, quiet continuity, drifting out. So, as we settle at the end of this long, strange journey, picture it all fading like candlelight. The gold embroidery, the diamonds, the velvet, the palaces, the portraits, the photo ops, and behind it all, the same soft outline. A woman in a dress she didn't choose, smiling for a world that never really saw her. You can almost hear the hush of it, the stillness that comes after centuries of performance, the sound of every untouchable woman finally exhaling. Because in the end, history doesn't remember their voices, but it remembers their poise. And maybe, just maybe, that's its own kind of quiet victory. Hey there, still awake? If so, congratulations. You've officially become an honorary court historian, the kind who survives every reign simply by observing quietly from the corner. Tonight, let's stay in that corner a bit longer. No more timelines, no more dynasties, just a gentle reflection on why humans, in every century, keep inventing the same unreachable woman. Why we build pedestals. Maybe it begins with comfort. Kings fall. Empires collapse. Taxes always go up. But beauty and poise? They stay still. When the world feels unpredictable, the untouchable woman becomes a promise. That somewhere, perfection exists. She's calm while we're anxious. Graceful while we're messy. Still while we're scrolling. She's the marble statue we whisper to when life gets too loud. A quiet fantasy that someone, somewhere, has figured out how to be flawless. Of course she hasn't. But that's the secret. She doesn't need to. The image does the work for her, and so, the myth survives. From crowns to cameras look around. It's not just queens anymore. Movie stars, pop idols, influencers with immaculate kitchens and suspiciously identical smiles. Different tools, same spell. Each photo, each filtered post, adds another layer of distance. We call it relatability, but it's performance in softer focus. The candlelight of Instagram instead of Versailles. And the audience, us, we know it's not real. We know the palace walls are digital now. But that doesn't stop the comfort, because maybe it's less about believing the illusion and more about needing it. A bedtime story for adults. A screensaver version of serenity. The loneliness of perfection. Every historical diary, every hidden letter says the same quiet thing. They were lonely. Catherine, Marie, Sisi, Alexandra, Diana, Grace, Meghan, different worlds, same isolation. Being ideal means never being known, and being watched means never being free. The human brain wasn't designed for worship. It was designed for connection, touch, laughter, imperfection. But the royal script forbids that. So, century after century, the women inside the myth trade real intimacy for ceremonial affection. Everyone loves them. No one knows them, and that's the saddest symmetry of all. Our reflection in the glass. The truth is, we're not just watching them. We're watching ourselves, Every time we click, stare, or comment, we reinforce the same cycle we think we're criticizing. We scroll through royal headlines while claiming we don't care about them. We say, it's just gossip, and then read 5 more paragraphs. The modern gaze is democratic, but it's still a gaze, still hungry, still shaping people into symbols, and maybe that's the final irony. We've all become a little royal ourselves, performing for invisible audiences, curating our images, chasing approval. Tiny crowns made of Wi-Fi and anxiety, a different kind of rebellion. But here's the soft twist. Some myths can be dismantled gently, not by scandal, not by speech, just by honesty. When someone famous posts a picture without makeup, or admits they're tired, or says, I don't have it all together, it chips away at centuries of marble. A small rebellion in pixels, a refusal to be untouchable. That's not weakness, that's evolution. And maybe that's where the real future queens live. Not in palaces, but in the quiet bravery of being seen as human. History as a mirror. If you look back now, through the centuries we've drifted across, you can almost see them standing in a row. Catherine of Aragon in her widow's black, Marie Antoinette in silk and nerves, Sisi brushing her hair for hours, Alexandra whispering prayers to a stranger, Diana walking through minefields in a bulletproof vest of empathy, Grace staring at the sea from her balcony, Kate poised behind composure, Meghan choosing voice over silence, different centuries, same quiet ache, each one teaching the next. You can be adored or understood, rarely both. The soft ending, maybe tonight, instead of thinking of them as porcelain figures, think of them as mirrors. They reflect our hunger for beauty, control, and certainty. They remind us that perfection is just another costume. Elegant, exhausting, and never quite real. In every era, the untouchable woman stands at the edge of the crowd, smiling faintly, hoping someone will notice she's human. Some did, most didn't, but history noticed, and that's something. Drift now, let the stories fade. The jewels lose their shine. The portraits blur back into parchment and dust. Imagine the sound of a distant palace clock, marking another midnight no one remembers. The queens are sleeping now. The cameras are off. The world for once isn't watching, and in that silence, they finally get what they were denied in life. Peace, stillness, touch.